Okay, recording.
Okay. Hi, everyone. This is I'm Rad Justin again. We are continuing our discussion of wage, labor, and capital, the lecture given by Karl Marx. The sections I'm going to go ahead first, and I'm going to share in case anyone wants to follow along or see for yourself the quotes, I'm putting it up in the open chat of the study room. I'm going to go ahead and boom. That is the link to I think that's chapter 6. So actually, yeah, you can look at it. This is for the last chapter, but we're going to be starting at chapter 4. So two ones previous to it. But we're going to be doing by what are wages determined, the nature and growth of capital, and the relations of wage, labor to capital, right? Those are the three things that we're going to be discussing here. And John is the one who originally made this presentation. Had some things to attend to, so I'm going to be taking over it. But I read through it. I think it's all good. Let's go ahead and get started. Um, so, by what are wages determined, right? That's chapter 4. Let me pull it up here. So, you got some quotes here. One says or if you have the physical copy of the book that we have, it's on page 12, right? And this quote says, "Now, the same general laws which regulate the price of commodities in general naturally regulate wages or the price of labor power. Therefore, the shorter the time required for training up to a particular sort of work, the smaller is the cost of production of the worker, the lower is the price of his labor power as wages. In those branches of industry in which hardly any period of apprenticeship is necessary and the mere bodily existence of the worker is sufficient, the cost of his production is limited almost exclusively to the commodities necessary for keeping him in working condition. The price of his work will therefore be determined by the price of the necessary means of subsistence." Um, Hold on, put my phone on silent. Okay. That's on page 12. And then it continues here. Thus, the cost of production of simple labor power amounts to the cost of the existence and propagation of the worker. The price of this cost of existence and propagation constitutes wages. The wages thus determined are called the minimum of wages. And then, so he says, discuss this notion of the minimum of wages to the minimum wage set by laws. Okay, yeah. So when you hear a minimum wage, what do people think that like what do you think of just instinctively when you hear the phrase minimum wage, right? Like what pops in your head?
A amount that legally you have to be paid for the labor that you do.
Yes, the legal minimum wage, like I believe it's $7.15 an hour federally, and in Kansas, unfortunately. Elsewhere it's different, but yeah, that's what most people think of minimum wage. But that's not what Marx is saying here, right? Would anyone like to summarize or take a shot at, like, in your own words, what you think he was talking about here by minimum wage?
I guess I'll go on a wing here. I'm guessing it's just the minimum amount of how do we put this? Compensation for what your actual like labor power has produced.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So, what do you have any idea of what might go into that?
The amount of time it took for you to learn your profession, the amount of literal time it took to physically exert yourself to doing the labor to create something or to do a service. Those would be the things I would guess.
Yeah, no, that's all true. Yeah, that's exactly right. The education is part of it, and even just in terms of sustenance, right? Like the if you have a very manually labor intensive job of I don't know construction, I'm just going to throw out. You're going to be burning a lot of calories, and then your wages will have to cover the cost of your food, for example, right? Because if you're starving, eventually you can't work. Like it's just physically impossible. Um, Rent is another one, because you kind of need a place to live in order to work, so you can go to sleep at night. Um, and that's a contradiction in and of itself, right? Because the rents are skyrocketing. So that's an interesting one.
So it's the minimum amount of commodities exchanged for the necessary minimum amount of commodities exchanged for the reproduction of capital.
Yes.
So essentially, he's saying that the worker gets the bare minimum in order for him or her or whatever, the worker, to come back to work and do the work again. It's the bare minimum required, and not like just enough so that you can work again.
Yes.
Correct. Okay. I think we got this one down. Does anyone have any other comments or anything they want to bring up about this, what was discussed here?
I want to say that, when the Nazis had the labor camps, they would pay wages below this level because they had so much labor coming in to trains, and so they didn't have to maintain that population. They literally squeezed everything out of them and then left them to die.
Yes, that's a very good point.
And about 10% of all the workers will die every week.
That's actually a really good point. And again, this was written in 1847, so Marx couldn't have known about that. But yeah, it was. And we see a similar. I'm not saying it's on that level yet, but like in United States prisons as well, we see a similar phenomenon where they do get paid a quote unquote wage, but it's like what, 30 cents an hour, maybe $1 an hour if you're lucky. And then that's all recycled back into like commissary and shit. So yeah, that's actually something we're going to talk about in a future slide. But that's a very good point. I'm going to go to the next one. Oops. Okay. So this is another quote I picked out. It says, "What then is the cost of production of labor power? It is the cost required for the maintenance of a laborer as a laborer and for his education and training as a laborer," right? So this is an interesting point that I think relates to something called materialist feminism, which I really hope we can do a discussion on that, right? So I know we already talked about this in the previous slide, but I'd like to expand on it more. What exactly goes into the, quote, maintenance of the laborer as a laborer? I know we talked about rent and food and other commodities, but can people think of anything else?
Repeat the question again.
Okay, so in this, when Marx talks about the cost of the production of labor power is the cost required of the maintenance of the laborer as a laborer and for his education and training as a laborer. So someone previously identified, education and training as a cost, which is valid. But I want to focus on this part where Marx says the maintenance of the laborer as a laborer. And I'm trying to ask, can people give some examples of what exactly goes into the maintenance of the laborer as a laborer?
I guess you could say probably healthcare and dentistry. You have to make sure your workers are going to be able to actually perform the work. I guess it depends on the labor itself, but it's kind of a sad example to say it that way. But maintenance of the laborer would entail their health, right? To an extent.
Yeah, absolutely. That is, yes, the health, which gives rise to another contradiction, right? Because look at the cost of healthcare in the United States. Can anyone think of it? I'm thinking of one in particular, but does anyone have any other examples?
If we're talking about like Marx's time, we'd be thinking of like company towns in which the question of food, the question of your bare necessities was kind of maybe what this is referring to. Essentially, like, what's the minimum amount of capital that can be put into a laborer without breaking that laborer as a resource of like production, and so like with Upton Sinclair's novels, you'll find like the protagonist working his ass off, being able to survive, but only having like 15 cents for like a week at the end of it,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then they get like trapped in it because they can't. You can't really afford to leave if all you got is 15 cents to your name. Yeah, there's one more example I'm thinking of though.
I feel
Anyone
like
else?
what you want us to say is more related to the next slide. I don't know what that's gonna be, but not the maintenance of the worker as an individual worker,
Mhm.
but as a maintenance of the working class as a whole, and for the reproduction of the workers.
Okay. Is anyone here a parent other than me? No.
Not
Okay.
personally.
Okay. So when parents go to work, they still have children, right? And the children need to go somewhere. So there's two places that tend to. That is like Danny said is absolutely correct. It's talking about maintenance of a laborer as a class, right? And working parents are a large part of that laboring class. So where do your kids go? They go to somewhere like a daycare if they're really young. They go to school where, and as well as some after school programs, or especially back in Marx's day, it was just basically, oh, well, you're a woman, that's your job, right? Like you're the stay at home mom, and that's the woman's duty is to raise children and all that, right? That's what was said, right? Still said to this day. And so it's very much a kind, like raising kids is very much a kind of labor, but people don't think about it that way. Because, like, one, it's not really. I mean, in some cases, it's paid a wage if you're like a school teacher or a daycare worker. But look at those wages, right? Like, they're some of the lowest wages and least compensated labor in this country. But it's absolutely necessary because if there's no one there to care for children, then literally people couldn't work. Like, I literally couldn't go to work. Well, I'm a remote worker, so that's how I deal with it. But yeah, like literally couldn't work without that. And then I wanted to bring up who usually performs that kind of labor, right? Not always, but usually. Who does that fall on?
The parent.
Well, yeah, all right.
Which one of the
Is for
It sounded like
for-
someone else wanted to say something.
which one of the two parents is it usually?
Yeah, which one of the two? Right.
Oh, I think probably. I mean, it can depend, but most of the time it's probably the mother.
Yes. Yes. It's does. I mean, I'm a single parent, so I have my kids here right now, actually. But yes, correct. Yeah, it usually falls on women, particularly oftentimes like women who aren't white as well. Like if you look at, like who works in daycares and who raises children and stuff. It often falls on immigrants and et cetera, right? So in other words, the most of the working class that is exploited, that kind of labor, which is extremely necessary for the maintenance of capitalism as a system and the reproduction of the working class as a class, falls on the most exploited people of the working class, and they're paid like the lowest wages. And in the case of like stay-at-home parents, they're not even paid. Like, does that make sense? What I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, go ahead. Who wanted to say something?
I think it was just a noise.
Oh, okay. All right. I'm gonna go to the next slide. Does anyone have any other comments about this before we go to the next slide? Okay. Cool. The nature and growth of capital. So I believe, let me check here. We are now on. Hold on.
Can I have a quick
Yeah,
comment?
go ahead.
So I think that we shouldn't really, like, in a day-to-day life, you can't really differentiate between doing labor to maintain yourself or spending money and buying other people's labor, and doing the same thing for your kids. Because you are cooking a meal, you are going to eat it yourself, and your kids are going to eat it too. But at the same time, the employer is not going to differentiate between people based on whether they have kids or not. And so people who have kids will end up in a much worse financial situation, and knowing that this is going to happen when people have kids. But there's so many people who would love to have kids, but they don't because of this. Like they just wouldn't be able to maintain themselves with some sort of dignity, you know.
That's a very good point. Yeah, because we're talking about the working class as a class, and yes, there's a lot of parents in the working class, but yeah, like they can just if you can't afford to get your kids to work or you can't afford childcare, then that's not your employer's problem. They're just gonna go find some single person or some person who doesn't have kids, or you know, and in that way, it's very cruel. That's a very good point. Okay.
You went back like a few slides. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that one.
Okay, so the nature and growth
you
of
need to
capital.
realize that this sort of responsibility was the government. Government job is not to maintain the working class on a daily basis, but to maintain them as a class and to reproduce the system itself.
Yes. Yes, that's a very good point. Because in the process of maintaining it as a class, then the implication is that you as an individual member of the class doesn't matter because there's enough people who can replace you. You are a commodity exactly the same as lumber or coal or electricity or whatever, right? Like that's kind of puts a human face on the and puts a human cost on treating everything as if it were a commodity, right? That's a very good point. Thank you, Danny. Okay. I'm going to move on here. So we're on the next chapter, the nature and growth of capital. So it says Marx starts off this section by giving a simple definition of capital that was being spread by the bourgeois economists of his time. He will analyze and add nuance to this definition. Capital consists of raw materials, instruments of labor, means of subsistence of all kind, which are employed in producing new raw materials, new instruments, and new means of subsistence. All these components of capital are created by labor, products of labor, accumulated labor. Accumulated labor that serves as a means to new production is capital, right? So I think what he's trying to say here is basically capital, like a thing is not capital just by virtue of being that thing, right? Capital becomes capital when it's placed in relationship with other things. That's the dialectical way of thinking, right? Yeah,
So-
does that make sense to everyone?
Yes, but I think like an example of what he's talking about would be like a assembly line or like a factory
Mm-hmm.
or like a vehicle for transport
Mm-hmm.
or like tools used to make new products
Mm-hmm.
that are themselves the products of labor.
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct?
Yeah, transportation is actually an interesting example. He has that's what Capital Volume 2 is about. But yeah. Yeah, exactly. It depends on how you're using those things. And then yeah, when he talks about accumulated labor, it's like, let me think of an example. Like, okay, if I'm building a house, right? I have lumber, right? And when they use lumber in building a house, you go to like the Home Depot and you get the pre-made, 2x4 planks of wood, and you put. I don't never really built a house, but you get what I'm saying, right?
Yeah.
But within those planks of wood that are being used in the framing of the house, another laborer elsewhere in turn contributed their labor power into turning the raw trees into the planks of wood, and then another worker went and took those planks of wood and treated them to resist corrosion and rot and whatever. And then another worker goes and puts those up, and then it becomes the framing of a building, right? I think that's what he meant by accumulated labor.
Yeah, so like the products of labor represent like different people's labor time put in to what is created.
Yes. Yes, exactly. Anyone else have a comment on this one? I'm gonna go to the next one. All right. Yeah, John said, yeah, the following quote is spicy. So yeah, you just got to keep in mind that when Marx wrote this was in 1847. It was contemporary with the language he uses at the time. So I'll just read the quote and then we'll go into it. It says, "A Negro is a Negro only under certain conditions does he become a slave. A cotton spinning machine is a machine for spinning cotton. Only under certain conditions does it become capital. Torn away from these conditions, it is as little capital as gold itself is money, or sugar is the price of sugar," right? And so, yeah, when Marx is saying that black people aren't slaves by their nature, they are slaves because the people are enslaving them and they're being used as slaves, right? And in the same way, all of the stuff with which capital consists isn't capital just by its own nature, capital because of how it's being used. And so, yeah, a little bit of side note. So, like, chattel slavery, that's what we say is when we think of slavery in the United States. That was still around in 1847, right? This was originally a lecture, which was turned into a book. This preceded the United States Civil War by 15 years, and furthermore, the use of the word Negro, like, that's contemporaneously, like, that was considered acceptable at the time. Nowadays, we wouldn't say that, but, like, even as recent as, like, the 1940s and 50s, you had black Marxists who used that word to refer to themselves, so...
You're good.
That's-
You don't have to defend it.
Yeah, okay. No, I was just, John was a little nervous about that, but yeah, okay.
It's fine.
Yeah, so anyways, does that make sense? Anyone have any comments on this one?
Yes, it provides context. Thank you.
Okay. We'll go to the next one. Let's see. The relations of production and their totality constitute what is called the social relations society, and moreover, a society at a definite stage of historical development, a society with peculiar distinctive characteristics. Ancient society, feudal society, bourgeois or capitalist society are such totalities of relations of production, each of which denotes a particular stage of development in the history of mankind. So he says what Marx is talking about here, is his and Engels' theory of historical materialism. He argues that the form that society takes can be traced back to the methods by which that society produces, right? Yeah, that's and then he says he makes the point that while a given capital may materialize as physical objects at one point in time or another, that those objects alone do not fully represent that capital. Those objects all have an exchange value expressible in money. Thus, those objects can be exchanged for other objects, which allow for a different type of production. That's what we refer to as commodities. Thus, the bodily form of capital may transform itself continually, while capital does not suffer the least alteration. So, okay, let me think here. Yeah, this is commodity production, right? So anyone want to take a shot, like, definition of commodity? What does that mean?
Commodity has a use value. Commodity has a value, an exchange value, and also like a use value. So a commodity is something that that is bought for an exchange value and represents like a given amount of. Well, I think that's what it is. Do you think that you could like expand on that, or
Yeah,
what
sure.
it is I said?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're correct in that commodities have use value and exchange value, but a commodity is something that is produced for the purpose of its exchange value. It's not, in other words, a capitalist who makes, I don't know, let's say you have a McDonald's franchise, right? Is the franchise owner of the McDonald's, do they own that franchise because they want to provide hamburgers and chicken nuggets to the community
No.
and feed people? No, they do it because they want to sell something and they want to make a profit off of it. That's what commodity means.
Yeah. So commodities exist because of their ability to make a profit, and to garner and to get back an exchange value, not provide a useful purpose.
Yes, exactly. I heard sound like someone else wanted to make a comment there.
I think it would be something like in the contemporary use, this would just be consumables. So
Mhm.
and so it'd be just the very basic thing of something that's produced to be sold.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. And then so let's see the quote here. Fatalities of production. Yeah, and so what he's saying is basically like, because we organize our whole society around this idea, right, of producing things for the purpose of an exchange value. And so he's saying that extends into every fabric of life. And that not only that, but we came to be here because of what happened in the past, right? Yeah. Does anyone have any comments about this?
Um. Uh. There's another. Did you read the last point?
Yeah, the bodily form of capital may transform itself continually, while capital does not suffer the least alteration. Oh yeah. Anyone have any thoughts about that one?
I mean, I guess I might be misreading this, but that does kind of address the way in which we have continual crashes and then kind of a readjustment of the bourgeois, I guess I want to say. You'll have a structure of people that own capital that might get moved around, but the capital itself still remains kind of the same, at least adjusted to survive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because capital is only exists in relationships. The capital is the relationship, and so even though the things that are being related might change, the capital is always there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very good point. Capital is a relationship. It's not just a single thing. And yeah, I think that's also a good point in that, when they say capital transforms itself, it could take the form of a loan, could take the form of machinery, but yeah, it's that relationship that it has with labor that makes it capital. Cool. Anything else anyone want to say about this? Okay, I'm gonna move to the next one. Okay, this is the final chapter of today. It's called Relation of Wage Labor to Capital, right? So I got this block quote here. It says, "What is it that takes place in exchange between the capitalist and the wage laborer? The laborer receives the means of subsistence in exchange for his labor power. The capitalist receives, in exchange for his means of subsistence, labor, the productive ability of the laborer, the creative force by which the worker not only replaces what he consumes, but also gives to the accumulated labor a greater value than it previously possessed. The laborer, oh, hi, Nick. The laborer, where is it? Oh, gets from the capitalist a portion of the existing means of subsistence. For what purpose do these means of subsistence serve him? For immediate consumption. But as soon as I consume means of subsistence, they are irrevocably lost to me, unless I employ the time during which these means sustain my life in producing new means of subsistence and creating by my labor new values in place of the values lost in consumption. But it is just this noble reproductive power that the laborer surrenders to the capitalist in exchange for means of subsistence received. Consequently, he has lost it for himself, right? Okay. Does anyone want to try and summarize what all that means?
I am not sure what.
I read it as it means laborers get a lopsided bargain. You know what I mean? They get not the best deal in the world. And so it says, what is it that takes? So yeah, I guess why do laborers if it's a bad deal, and why is it tolerated? What Why does it continue to exist this way?
I think because of I mean, it's designed to make people forced to work, that they have to work in order to survive, because you need money. So you can either get this bad deal and get the maybe like a bare minimum means of subsistence, or you don't get that and then you starve.
Pretty much. Yeah, like if you don't work, then you can't afford rent. You won't have a home to stay in. You can't afford food. Can't really go hunting. I mean, you can go hunting, but that assumes you live in an area with like wildlife and not like the middle of a city or something, right? And then capitalists get the better end of the deal. I think it goes back to this part here where he talks about the capitalist receives in exchange for providing the means of subsistence the creative force by which the worker not only replaces what he consumes, but also gives to the accumulated labor a greater value, right? So the laborer just gets enough to survive, whereas the capitalist can not only have enough to survive, but then they also have enough to produce more beyond that, right? And yeah, that's like the nature of the exchange. Everything's designed that way, right? And then another thing I wrote here was implied in this is that it is profitable for a capitalist to decrease the cost of the means of subsistence, right? Because if the capitalist is paying a wage, which is what the laborer uses for the means of subsistence, if they can decrease the cost of that subsistence, that means they can keep more for themselves, right? So what does that look like in actuality?
If it is that the means of subsistence, the price of the means of subsistence goes down, then that means that the capitalist can pay less to the worker for them to be able to get their means of subsistence. So it's all about them paying them less. So if the means of subsistence, like their bare minimum in order for them to come back to work, the price of that goes down, then they can pay less. Their wages can go down for the bare minimum.
Yes, absolutely. Because if wages come out of or a slice of profits. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. And then Danny dropped off, but yeah, Danny raised a very good point that the cost of labor be driven below the cost of the means of subsistence. Yeah, Danny brought up the example of prisons and concentration camps, and there's a material reason for that, right? But yeah, we already discussed that. Does anyone have any other comments about this? I'm going to move to the next one. Say that the interests of capital and the interests of the workers are identical signifies only this, that capital and wage labor are two sides of one and the same relation. The one conditions the other in the same way that the usurer and the borrower condition one another. Usurer means like someone who lends out money at interest. As long as the wage laborer remains a wage laborer, his lot is dependent upon capital. That is what the boasted community of interests between worker and capitalist amounts to. If capital grows, the mass of wage labor grows, the number of wage workers increases. In a word, the sway of capital extends over a greater mass of individuals. That is exactly what Danny said earlier about it as a class, right? So Marx talks at length about how the proletariat depends upon the bourgeoisie for subsistence. I think we established that. But I want to talk about the inverse of that, right? Because Marx just said it's a two-way relation. So how does the bourgeoisie depend upon the proletariat?
Well, I mean, they need the workers' labor power in order for them to make the products that they sell back to them that they make the commodities. So they need the workers to put in their labor power to make the commodities that the capitalists will then sell back to them.
Right, yeah, they need people to do work so that they can make commodities, exactly.
There's
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, there's also an element in that kind of human rights and generally what we consider standard for us is something that's controlled subconsciously by the working class. If there is something that a vast majority of the working class decides is something that they would want to become violent about, very quickly the bourgeois have very limited amount of things that can be done as long as that populace is, I don't know, just like casually armed. And so it's kind of I know there's been other like Marxist essays on kind of this concept of a lot of our human rights are wrapped up in that, just because if they are taken away at a too quick of a rate, working class organization can kind of like counter those moves by having mass violence and riots and stuff, which is what we've seen even in our lifetime.
So you're saying that like the taking away of like workers' rights needs to happen like slowly, because if it happens too fast, then like workers will catch on to it and then they'll start to organize to like act in their own interests. So the property owning class tries to take away rights slowly, just like, you know, piece by little piece until it just gets worse and worse for the workers.
Yeah,
because it's slower.
So one that would have been talked about in this case was Earl Browder, the second president of the Communist Party in the U.S., discussed in an essay about kind of fascism within the U.S., this concept of how fascists at the time had to kind of cater a lot of their positions to whatever Roosevelt was doing. And they couldn't avoid that. They couldn't push for anything further because at the time, working class organizations simply would make their positions politically suicidal for them to advocate for anything further. And so they pushed it as hard as they can, and then they stopped right at the line, in which case they thought that they would eventually become like irrelevant.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Only thing I would add to that is that yeah, sometimes it's like they say, you know, you put the frog and just drop it in a pot of boiling water, it's going to notice right away. But if you crank the heat up over time, then it doesn't notice that it's boiling until it's too late.
Yeah.
But there's another way around that, which I think our ruling class has perfected, of creating a state of exception. And what I mean by that is 9/11, right? Before 9/11, if you told someone in the 1980s, like, hey, there's a government agency that like wiretaps all your phones, and you know, if you go to the airport, you're gonna have to take your shoes off and let a federal agent basically pat you down and more or less molest you for security purposes and all that. They would probably think you're out of your mind. But then suddenly, and I'm not trying to say that this was like a purposely planned conspiracy. I'm just using an example. But
It is.
9/11 happens. And then they say, oh, yeah, well, there's this great state of exception and a state of emergency. And now, because of it, we need a Department of Homeland Security and all this other stuff, right? And I think that state of exception has now become the norm, and people have become accustomed to it. Yeah, that's a really good point.
We should have a slideshow exposing the truth on 9/11.
Please don't. Dear God.
We really should do. That would be good. But yeah, yeah, so you were saying that it's like before hard to believe that it would be the way that it is after 9/11. So then that relates to this in Justin,
I was just or go ahead.
You were saying
Yeah, I was saying because it was brought up that you have to get people to adapt to things slowly over time. So I was saying that's true, but sometimes these changes are also passed as a result of a state of exception that's created, and I use 9/11 as an example of that.
like a state of exception, like exception as in
like the war on terrorism, right? Like, oh well, things are different, and we have to have all this because if we don't have all these measures, then
Oh.
Al Qaeda is gonna get us, or
So
whatever, right?
it's like, we got to do this, or else all the bad things are gonna happen. So it's like an excuse for getting worse. So
Yeah, events can happen that change the acceptability of a certain proposal for the working class or for broader society in general. The sinking of the Lusitania kind of got Americans on board with World War I. 9/11 got us on board with pretty much going anywhere in the Middle East, and removing a lot of our rights. It's something that can happen that will exacerbate the populace, that then gives them ability to slide that scale back to the hands of the bourgeois. But without that there, they can't do anything. Without a 9/11, a lot of that stuff might have not been possible without it being kind of a creeping process.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. That was exactly what I was trying to say. But I want to draw it back to the relationship between wage labor and capital. So, like, now that we talked about that, I want to say, because the bourgeoisie depend upon the proletariat as a class, what are the political implications of that for labor and the proletariat as a class, right? There's a word I'm thinking of.
Because wait, repeat the question again.
So, what are the political implications for the proletariat as a class of the fact that the bourgeoisie depend on them to do labor?
Well, the proletariat, the workers comprise like the majority. So, I mean, they're the ones that are making the products, the commodities. So,
Yes.
That would. Well, there's a lot. There's a lot of political implications for that.
I'm thinking of a word, though, of something that workers can do when they get together and decide that they don't like whatever conditions, and it's like something they can do collectively.
Organize.
And go on strike and withhold their labor.
Yeah. They can do that.
Yeah, that's the point I was trying to get at there, because yeah, a lot if you'll notice, a lot of things in our society are designed to alienate us and to fracture us and to keep us thinking of ourselves as separate individuals and not as members of a class. And that when we do begin to think of ourselves as members of a class with common interests, as well as our class interests being fundamentally opposed to those of the bourgeoisie, right? That means we can take collective action, such as organizing or organizing strikes or whatnot. And a lot of resources are pumped in to making sure people don't think that way. That's the point I was trying to get at there. But then, let's see, I'm trying to be respectful of time here. So the last point I want to make on this is, okay, when workers organize collectively like that, we call it a union, more or less, right?
Yeah.
So what I want to ask is, what about for the bourgeoisie? Do the bourgeoisie have a union? What does it look like when they collectively organize?
It is true that they because the property owning class, they're in a class war against labor. So I mean, they might have disagreements, but altogether, like, they kind of agree on similar aspects, sort of similar how working people will agree on similar aspects, but there's different sections that have different material interests, but they're different. But there's certain things that sort of like comprise, or certain like wants or interests that comprise a higher
Nick
majority.
Actually in the chat said it. The Chamber of Commerce. That is the union.
I think more easily is the state, right?
Yeah.
The state is it's ultimately a union, a collective rule by the bourgeoisie, and so I would say that the state is the union, is the cooperative bargaining of the bourgeoisie, I would say.
Yes. Yes, that is also correct. Because who controls the state? It's the bourgeoisie. It responds to their interests. Yeah, that's the point I was trying to get at here. Like that the bourgeoisie, they already work together collectively as a class. So like we can do that too. That was the point I was trying to make here. Again, I'm trying to be respectful of time, so I'm going to move on. Okay, this is the last slide. All right. So just real quick, I said the money price of labor power, nominal wages, do not therefore coincide with the actual or real wages, i.e., with the amount of commodities which are actually given in exchange for the wages, right? So if we speak of a rise or fall of wages, we have to keep in mind not only the money price of labor power, the nominal wages, but also the real wages, right? So I brought this up because of inflation. I mean, everybody who goes to the grocery store or buys anything already knows about that, right? So, how does inflation affect the bourgeoisie?
Well, in terms of nominal wages and real wages, what is the difference between nominal and real wages?
Oh, that's a good question. Nominal wages is, okay, I go to a job and I make $20 an hour. That's my nominal wage. I'm paid
Okay.
$20 in an hour. A real wage says, okay, this is what that $20 an hour can actually buy. And the classic example is if I made $5 an hour in the year 1900, that is a much, much greater amount than $5 an hour in the year 2023, right?
Yeah.
So as a way of comparing those, we look at real wages, which is, again, how much of commodities can your dollar purchase?
So real wages describe like purchasing power
Exactly.
of like the wage or the money that you get.
Yes, exactly. That's right.
Okay. So then the question that you asked before that was
How does inflation affect the bourgeoisie?
I think I think that the class, the property owning class, they sometimes they will raise the price intentionally and then they'll blame it on something else. But then they really just are using something else as an excuse. But they're just raising the prices to get like more money. So I mean, it would affect the bourgeoisie because they would get more profit.
Yes, they use it as an excuse. I have to find the article, but there was a news article where this company said they made like 700% profit since inflation has started going up. It's like, okay, so you're telling us you have to raise the price of these eggs and milk and all this other stuff, but meanwhile, you're having record profits.
They say that, they have to raise the price because eventually, like, the supply will go down, but then it's really just an excuse.
Exactly. We already see that. And then, the last thing I wanted to touch on here is so related to, and again, Marx couldn't have really known this as much as we know it now because it was different times. Everyone in the working class is debt, whether it's like student loan debt, credit card debt, a note on your car, something like that, right? So, and in order to control inflation, what happens? You've seen it in the news. The Federal Reserve or the central bank raises the interest rates, right? To decrease the money supply, control inflation. So I was just saying, given the saturation of debt, that increasing the interest rate actually drives down real wages, even though it's said that they're doing it to control inflation. I think it still drives down real wages because you only get so much money a month, right? And if the interest rate on all your debt is going up, that's more of your income that has to service that debt and less of the income you have to buy things you need to live.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, even if your wages are going up, if you have to pay more on your credit cards or your car loan or your student loans or whatever, if the amount you pay to service those debts is more than the rate that your wages rise up, then you effectively have taken a cut to your real wages, even though your nominal wages went up, right? That's the point I was trying to make there.
So
Um,
So I want to ask, like, I actually am interested about this because I've heard about interest rate a lot. So, what is like interest rate? Okay, the interest rate is going up,
Yes.
down. How is it that the interest rate goes up or down? Where is it decided? Like how? Because I've heard this a lot, and like
Yes.
I understand that this is important to understanding like
Mhm.
the financialization of the economy, but
Mhm.
I don't really know if I understand it.
Yeah. I can explain it. Or does anyone else want to take a shot?
I guess I'll take a shot. It's going to be complicated as hell, but the general thing that they will continually point to is supply and demand. That is to say, the more of a supply that you have something, and as long as the demand stays the same, it should go down in value. So if you have like 1,000 fidget spinners, and the demand is only 1,000 fidget spinners, that should be a price. If you have 1 million of those, but only 1,000 people still want fidget spinners, it's going to be much harder then to like sell them at a profit or something like that, or they're incredibly cheap. If there's 1,000 people that want fidget spinners, but there's only 10 fidget spinners, well, now the market is much more competitive for that thing. This is a gross oversimplification, but the more that we produce currency and everything, can have some planned inflation in it.
But
And it's
like
kind of-
that's not. But that's actually not like. That's
Yeah.
sort of like a myth, though. Like that money,
yeah, it is.
the
It's
creating
an oversimplification.
money, but yeah, but like but the interest rate, like how is it that goes up or down? Like who
Yeah. Yeah.
it's the Federal Reserve, right?
Yes, so basically the Federal Reserve sets it's called the effective federal funds rate. And so the way this works is that the Federal Reserve lends to other banks on very short term, and they have a base interest rate. Right now, I believe 4.83%, right?
Can I so the Treasury is the people, they make the Federal Reserve like gives out money on behalf of the Treasury. So Treasury, like the people of the Treasury, they'll put in like a computer, like whatever dollar, and then like the Federal Reserve, like the central bank, because the Federal Reserve is central, they'll they're the ones that decide like where the funds go on behalf of like the Treasury. But like is that
not kind of this is getting complicated. Okay, so the Treasury creates bonds, right? T-bonds, Treasury bonds of varying lengths, anywhere from like 30 days to 10 years, right? And those bonds are set at an interest rate. And those bonds represent government debt, right? And they pay periodic interest. The Federal Reserve helps set the interest rate of those bonds. And then so the idea is when the government wants to do deficit spending, they go and what do they do? They go and sell treasury bonds. People buy them, and that increases the money supply because those T-bonds are paying out interest above and beyond what was spent on them, right? But what the Federal Reserve will do sometimes to control the money supply is they will go and actually buy those bonds back up, take them out of circulation, and then when they crank the interest rate up, that's like removing money from the money supply, because when you pay interest, you're paying it back to a bank, and then those banks in turn have outstanding debts with the Federal Reserve, and so those banks are taking your interest money and paying it back to the Fed, and that's like, and the Fed doesn't do anything with the money. So in that way, that's how they decrease the money supply.
And interest rates, interest rates are one of the ways how it is that banks like make like a profit off of loans, but it's like a rent. It's like you get a loan for whatever amount of money, and then you get charged interest, whatever percent, and then so you pay the interest. So if the Federal Reserve raises the interest rates,
Yes.
then what is the effect? Because how is it that the Federal Reserve, how is it that they raise interest rates, or what? How is it that works?
They
They're
just
able
say,
to set the interest rate is for one. They just can.
yeah.
But
They can if they want to do a negative interest rate.
But
which would be fun.
isn't interest a part of like a bunch of different loans? So
Yes, but every bank is in turn tied to the Federal Reserve. Like banks, that's why the Fed's interest rate affects the interest rate of everything else, because every bank bases their interest rates off the rates set by the Federal Reserve.
because like the private banks, they get like because almost like all money in the economy, like 99.9, like basically almost all money in the economy is from typing numbers on a computer. And,
Yes.
and that comes, I think, like on behalf, like private banks, they have like an account at the Treasury, and have an account at like the Federal Reserve, and then there's an account at the private bank. So then, like in the Treasury, they like put the money on the computer, and then it goes to
Yes.
the private bank's account of whoever.
Yeah. Hold on, I think Sam wanted to say something.
Okay.
No,
okay.
I didn't.
Oh, I thought I saw your mic go off. My bad.
Okay. So yeah, that like they, Treasury, they make the money, and then you have an account, or everyone has like an account, like at the Federal Reserve and like the Treasury or something.
Yes, at
And-
the Federal Reserve.
Okay, at the Federal Reserve, and then the Federal Reserve with the Treasury, they make money, and then they type a number, and then it goes to the private bank, and then it goes into your bank account.
Yes, it's essentially all made up like that. That's how it works. No one said it's makes perfect sense, but that's
Well,
how
no,
it goes.
I'm just but the interest rate, because so all banks are tied to the Federal Reserve, which okay, but if the Federal Reserve just says, okay, we're gonna raise interest rates, how, like, I'm not sure how it is that. Okay, because raising interest, what is the effect of raising interest rates?
It increases the cost of debt.
The cost of debt.
You
And
mean you have a credit card, right? Or do you have a credit card, student loan, anything like that?
I don't have a credit card or a student loan, but like I understand that sort of, but I don't
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good point. I'm more than happy to continue this conversation. I think I want to wrap up the video, and then I will stick around and I can discuss this with you. But yeah, I think we should at least wrap up the video, because that's a good point. We are getting off the topic of wage labor and capital. But I would love to discuss this with you after we close up the video.
all right, I'll stop recording. Could like, me and you, like, if we're just talking, could I just record? So like,
Yeah, if you want to record it and we want to go, but yeah, I apologize. I kind of lost track of time there. We want to let other people are welcome to stay around, but yeah, I think we're done with the lesson for today.
Right.
My bad.
thanks guys.
No, you're good. And I don't mind having these topics. It's just, as someone who went through a couple business econ classes, I know that this subject messes with people even there who are prioritized in just kind of wanting to know how capitalism works, like in the sense to just, play the system.
Yeah, I have an accounting degree, so like this is kind of like my subject matter, but yeah, definitely. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and close this out then. But yeah, my people are welcome to hang around and listen if they want, but we're done with the lecture there. I'm gonna go ahead and I stop sharing my screen. Okay. How do I do that? Oh, here we go. Cool. All right. Okay.
All right.
So,
Hold on. Okay, I'm gonna start recording. Thank you.
okay.